Everyone treats banks like neutral storage facilities where you park money between spending it. And yet, banks themselves use a completely different strategy with their own capital that most people never learn about. You walk into a branch and they offer you a savings account paying 0.5% interest, while they simultaneously lend that exact same money out at 7% for mortgages and 18% for credit cards. The spread between what they pay you and what they earn is how banks build billion-dollar institutions. Meanwhile, you're on the wrong side of that equation, earning pennies while they harvest the real returns. The gap between how banks treat your money and how they treat their own money represents one of the most overlooked wealth-building opportunities available to ordinary people. Here's what nobody explains about the banking system. The strategies that make banks profitable aren't secret or illegal or reserved for financial insiders. They're just never taught because banks profit more when you don't understand them. The mechanics that allow regional banks to turn modest deposits into substantial returns are the exact same mechanics you can use to accelerate your own wealth building if you know where to look. Understanding this strategy, and more importantly, implementing it correctly, is the difference between letting banks profit from your ignorance and actually using their own playbook against them. There's a method called the 4-tier banking strategy that reveals not just how banks multiply money, but exactly how you can replicate their approach with your personal finances to build wealth faster than traditional saving and investing alone. Once you grasp this strategy, your entire relationship with money changes because you stop thinking like a bank customer and start thinking like a bank owner. Let me walk through exactly how this works. The first tier in the 4-tier banking strategy is understanding something called the velocity of money, which is the fundamental principle that makes banks wealthy. Velocity refers to how many times the same dollar generates returns within a given period. Banks don't make money by holding your deposits. They make money by putting those deposits to work immediately, lending them out multiple times through fractional reserve banking, collecting interest on money that technically belongs to you. Consider what happens when you deposit $10,000 into a savings account. The bank pays you perhaps $50 per year in interest, a 0.5% return. But that $10,000 doesn't sit idle in a vault. The bank immediately lends out $9,000 of it, keeping only $1,000 as reserves. They lend that $9,000 to someone buying a house at 7% interest, generating $630 annually. They've just turned your $10,000 into $630 of income for themselves while paying you $50. That's a $580 profit on money you deposited. But it gets more interesting. The person who borrowed that $9,000 uses it to buy a house, and that $9,000 gets deposited into the seller's bank account. That bank now lends out $8,100 of it to another borrower. The same original $10,000 has now generated 2 separate loans totaling over $17,000, each producing interest income. This multiplication effect is how banks transform modest capital into substantial returns. The critical insight isn't that banks are somehow cheating the system. It's that they've organized their entire business model around maximizing the velocity of money. Every dollar works multiple times, generating returns from multiple sources simultaneously. Most people do the opposite. They let money sit idle in checking accounts, earning nothing, or they lock it away in investments they can't access, or they spend it on depreciating assets that generate no return at all. The velocity of their money is essentially zero. The first tier of the strategy requires you to restructure how you think about every dollar you control. Instead of asking, where should I put this money? You need to ask, how many times can this money work for me before I eventually spend it? This shift in thinking opens up approaches that most people never consider because they're stuck in the traditional save or spend binary. The second tier addresses how to actually implement high-velocity money management without taking excessive risk or tying up funds you might need. This is where most people misunderstand the banking strategy and make costly mistakes. They hear about velocity and think it means constantly moving money around, day trading, flipping assets, or using complex financial instruments they don't understand. That's not what banks do, and it's not what you should do. Banks create velocity through layered uses of the same capital. They use deposits to back loans while simultaneously using those same deposits as reserves for additional financial activities. The key is that each layer serves a different purpose and operates on a different timeline, which means the bank maintains liquidity while still maximizing returns. You can replicate this layered approach through what I call strategic stacking. Here's how it works. Start with a foundation of liquid emergency savings, perhaps 3 to 6 months of expenses in a high-yield savings account. This money sits in Tier 1, earning modest interest but remaining fully accessible. This is your reserve requirement, exactly like banks maintain reserves. Next, take additional savings and move them into Tier 2, which consists of short-term investments that generate better returns while remaining relatively accessible. This might include short-term bond funds, treasury bills, or conservative balanced funds. The returns are better than savings accounts, but you can still access the money within days or weeks if absolutely necessary. Tier 3 involves medium-term investments with higher growth potential. This is where you place money you don't need for several years into diversified stock portfolios, index funds, or other growth-oriented investments. The timeline is longer, which allows for higher returns, but the money is still technically accessible if you face a genuine emergency, though you'd prefer not to touch it. Tier 4 represents your long-term wealth-building investments, retirement accounts, real estate, business investments, anything with a timeline of 10 years or more. This tier captures the highest returns because you're taking advantage of long-term compounding and tax advantages, but the money is either locked up or would be costly to access early. Here's where the velocity concept becomes powerful. The same income that funds your Tier 1 emergency savings also funds your Tier 2 short-term investments, which also funds your Tier 3 medium-term portfolio, which also funds your Tier 4 long-term wealth building. You're not choosing between these tiers. You're filling all four simultaneously by directing your monthly cash flow through the system strategically. Banks don't choose between maintaining reserves and making loans. They do both with the same deposits. You don't choose between emergency savings and long-term investing. You fund both by understanding that money flows through different tiers before ultimately being spent. The practical implementation looks like this. When you receive income, you immediately direct a percentage into each tier based on your current needs and goals. Maybe 10% goes to Tier 1 until you've built adequate reserves. Then that 10% redirects to Tier 2. Perhaps 15% goes directly to Tier 3, and 10% goes to Tier 4 in retirement accounts. The remaining percentage covers your living expenses. The critical insight is that money doesn't just sit in Tier 1 forever. It flows through the tiers based on your timeline and needs. Your emergency fund in Tier 1 might eventually move to Tier 2 once you've built it up beyond immediate needs. Your Tier 2 investments might shift to Tier 3 as your timeline extends. Everything flows upward through the tiers, with each tier serving a specific purpose in your overall wealth-building system. The third tier of the banking strategy involves something banks understand intuitively, but most individuals completely miss, which is the concept of arbitrage through borrowed money. Banks borrow money at low rates and lend it out at higher rates. The difference between these rates, the spread, is pure profit. You can implement a version of this same strategy, but you need to understand exactly when it makes sense and when it becomes dangerous. The key principle is this: borrowing money to invest only makes sense when three conditions are met simultaneously. First, the interest rate on the borrowed money must be lower than the expected return on the investment. Second, the investment timeline must be long enough to weather short-term volatility. Third, you must have sufficient cash flow to service the debt without stress. even if the investment temporarily underperforms. Most people violate at least one of these conditions, which is why borrowed money destroys more wealth than it creates for individual investors. They borrow at high rates, invest in volatile assets with short timelines, or stretch their cash flow so thin that any disruption forces them to sell at the worst possible moment. But when all three conditions are met, strategic use of borrowed money can dramatically accelerate wealth building. The most common example is mortgage debt used to purchase real estate. If you can borrow money at 4% to buy a property that appreciates at 6% annually while also generating rental income, you're capturing the spread between your borrowing cost and your total return. The property appreciates on the full value, not just your down payment, which creates leverage that multiplies your returns. A $50,000 down payment on a $250,000 property that appreciates to $265,000 in 1 year represents a $15,000 gain on your $50,000 investment, a 30% return. The same $15,000 appreciation on a property you bought with cash would only represent a 6% return on your $250,000 investment. The leverage multiplies your returns by allowing you to control a larger asset with less capital. Banks understand this implicitly. They use depositor money, which costs them almost nothing, to fund loans that generate substantial returns. They're leveraging other people's money to create profits. You can do a version of the same thing by strategically using low-cost debt to invest in appreciating assets, but only when you can meet all three conditions I mentioned. The danger zone is using this strategy with high-interest debt, short timelines, or stretched cash flow. Borrowing on credit cards at 18% to invest in stocks is almost certain to end badly because even if the stocks perform well, you're unlikely to consistently beat 18% returns, and any downturn will devastate you. Similarly, borrowing to invest with money you'll need in 2 years exposes you to timing risk, where you might be forced to sell during a downturn. The banking strategy isn't about maximizing leverage. It's about using strategic, low-cost leverage in situations where the math strongly favors you and you have enough margin of safety to weather volatility. For most people, this means being thoughtful about mortgage debt, possibly using portfolio margin in retirement accounts if they understand the risks, and avoiding consumer debt entirely. The fourth and final tier of the banking strategy addresses something that banks obsess over but most individuals ignore completely, which is the tax efficiency of every financial decision. Banks structure their operations to minimize tax liability legally, using every available deduction, credit, and accounting method to keep more of what they earn. You can implement a simplified version of this same tax optimization that dramatically improves your wealth-building trajectory. The fundamental principle is that it's not what you earn that matters, it's what you keep after taxes. A 10% return that's fully taxable might leave you with only somewhat cents after tax if you're in a 30% tax bracket. A 7% return that's tax-free leaves you with the full sum. The tax-free return is actually better even though the nominal return is lower. Banks structure their investments to maximize after-tax returns, and you should do the same. This means prioritizing tax-advantaged accounts like 401ks, IRAs, and HSAs before taxable investment accounts. It means holding tax-inefficient investments like bonds and REITs in retirement accounts where the income isn't taxed annually, while holding tax-efficient investments like index funds in taxable accounts where you only pay taxes when you sell. It means harvesting tax losses in down years to offset gains and strategically timing the recognition of income to minimize your tax bracket. Most people approach taxes as something that happens to them rather than something they can actively manage. They earn money, pay whatever taxes are automatically withheld, and never think strategically about structuring their finances to minimize tax drag. Banks do the opposite. Every financial decision is evaluated based on its after-tax impact. The difference compounds dramatically over decades. Consider two investors who both earn 10% annual returns over 30 years. Ambungat ba nuitsansa. Here, the first investor holds everything in taxable accounts and pays taxes on dividends and capital gains annually, reducing their effective return to perhaps 7.5% after taxes. The second investor maximizes tax-advantage accounts and uses tax-efficient strategies, keeping their effective return closer to 9.5% after taxes. That 2% difference in after-tax returns turns a $10,000 investment into roughly $76,000 for the first investor and $152,000 for the second investor. The tax-efficient investor ends up with twice as much money from the same starting point and the same nominal returns, simply by minimizing the tax drag on their wealth building. The banking strategy recognizes that taxes are one of your largest lifetime expenses, and treating them as manageable rather than inevitable can double your wealth building effectiveness. This doesn't require aggressive tax avoidance or questionable strategies. It simply means using the legal tax advantages that already exist, like retirement accounts, tax loss harvesting, and strategic asset location. Now, let me explain how these 4 tiers work together to create something more powerful than any single strategy alone. The velocity principle ensures your money works multiple times before you spend it. The layered tier system gives you both liquidity and growth simultaneously. The strategic leverage amplifies your returns when conditions are favorable, and the tax efficiency ensures you keep more of what you earn. Remove any single element and the system becomes weaker. Maximize velocity but ignore tax efficiency, and you'll generate returns that get eaten by taxes. Use leverage without maintaining proper liquidity tiers, and you'll be forced to sell at the worst moments. Optimize taxes but never increase your velocity, and you'll build wealth slower than necessary. Let me make this concrete with specific numbers that show what happens when you implement this full strategy. Imagine you're 30 years old earning $75,000 annually. You commit to saving 20% of your income, which is $15,000 per year. Following the traditional approach, you might put this into a single retirement account, earning it annually. After 30 years, you've contributed $450,000 and grown your portfolio to approximately $800,000. That's solid wealth building through basic compounding. Now implement the 4-tier banking strategy with the same $15,000 annual savings. You structure your savings to flow through multiple tiers. You build a $20,000 emergency fund in Tier 1 over the first 18 months, earning 4% in a high-yield savings account. You direct $3,000 annually into Tier 2 short-term investments, earning 6%. You put $7,000 annually into Tier 3 medium-term investments, earning 9%. You maximize Tier 4 by contributing $5,000 to a Roth IRA, earning 10% tax-free. After you've built adequate Tier 1 reserves, you strategically use a mortgage to purchase a rental property, using the Tier 1 funds as your emergency reserve while the property appreciates and generates income. The rental property provides both cash flow and appreciation, effectively creating another return stream from capital that's still backing your emergency reserves. You optimize tax efficiency by holding bonds in your Roth IRA and stocks in taxable accounts, harvesting losses annually, and using the mortgage interest deduction. After 30 years, your Tier 1 emergency fund has grown to $30,000. Your Tier 2 investments have accumulated to roughly $250,000. Your Tier 3 portfolio has grown to approximately $900,000. Your Tier 4 Roth IRA has reached about $900,000, completely tax-free. Your rental property, purchased for $200,000 with a $40,000 down payment, has appreciated to $450,000 and generated $180,000 in net rental income over 30 years after expenses and mortgage payments. Your total wealth is approximately $700,000 compared to $1,800,000 from the traditional approach, a 50% improvement from the same annual savings amount. The difference comes entirely from implementing the banking strategy, maximizing velocity by having money work in multiple tiers simultaneously, using strategic leverage through the rental property mortgage, and optimizing tax efficiency through proper account selection and structure. The banking strategy isn't about taking excessive risk or using complex financial instruments. It's about organizing your finances the way banks organize theirs, ensuring every dollar works as hard as possible, in as many ways as possible, as tax efficiently as possible. I want to address the most common objection people raise when they hear this strategy, which is that it sounds complicated and time-consuming to manage. Banks have entire departments managing their capital allocation, risk management, and tax optimization. How can an individual replicate this without making it a full-time job? The answer is that the banking strategy requires more upfront setup than traditional approaches, but less ongoing maintenance than you'd think. The key is building the right structure once, then letting it run automatically. Setting up your 4 tiers might take a weekend of focused work. You need to open the right accounts, set up automatic transfers, and establish your allocation percentages. But once that structure exists, it runs itself. Your paycheck automatically flows into the different tiers based on the percentages you've established. Your investments automatically rebalance based on the target allocations you've set. Your tax optimization happens automatically because you've structured your accounts correctly from the beginning. You might spend a few hours per year reviewing your strategy, rebalancing if necessary, and harvesting tax losses. But the day-to-day management is essentially zero because you've built a system that operates automatically. Banks don't manually manage every transaction. They build systems that execute their strategy automatically, and you can do the same thing. The complexity isn't in the ongoing management. It's in understanding the strategy well enough to set it up correctly the first time. Another common concern is whether this strategy works for people with lower incomes or those just starting out. The banking strategy might seem designed for people who already have substantial capital to deploy across multiple tiers and investment categories. Here's the reality. The banking strategy actually matters more when you have less money because you can't afford to waste any of it through inefficient structures. When you're working with limited capital, maximizing the velocity and tax efficiency of every dollar becomes critical. If you're only saving $3,000 per year, you might start by building Tier 1 exclusively for the first year, creating a small emergency fund. Then you split your savings between Tier 1 and Tier 4, building your emergency fund while also capturing tax advantages in a Roth IRA. As your income grows, you add Tier 3, then eventually Tier 2. The tiers don't all need to be funded simultaneously from day one. They're a framework for organizing your wealth building as your capacity grows. The velocity principle works at any income level. Even with $200 in monthly savings, you can structure that money to work in multiple ways by choosing accounts and investments that serve dual purposes. Your emergency fund earns interest while remaining liquid. Your retirement contributions grow tax-free while also reducing current taxes. Every dollar works harder than it would in a traditional approach. The banking strategy scales from modest beginnings to substantial wealth. The principles remain the same regardless of the absolute dollar amounts involved. Let me address one final critical element that determines whether this strategy actually works for you, which is the psychological component that banks manage through institutional discipline, but individuals must manage through personal commitment. Banks don't make emotional decisions about capital allocation. They have policies, procedures, and institutional structures that enforce discipline regardless of how individual employees feel about current market conditions. When markets crash, banks don't panic and liquidate their loan portfolios. They maintain their strategy because the institution is designed to weather volatility. Individual investors lack this institutional discipline. You will feel tempted to abandon the strategy when markets drop, when a tier underperforms, when you see others making faster money through speculation, or when you need money for something you want right now. The banking strategy only works if you maintain it through these emotional challenges. This requires what I call predetermined commitment, which means deciding in advance how you'll respond to specific situations before those situations arrive. Before markets crash, decide that you'll maintain your tier allocations and continue your automatic contributions regardless of how scary the news becomes. Before you see a speculative investment opportunity, decide that you'll only invest money from Tier 3 or Tier 4, never from Tier 1 or Tier 2. Before you want to buy something expensive, decide that you'll only make the purchase if you can afford it from current cash flow without disrupting your tier funding. Banks make these decisions through policy. You make them through advance commitment. The difference between people who successfully implement the banking strategy and those who abandon it isn't intelligence or market timing or luck. It's the discipline to maintain the strategy through the inevitable periods when it feels like it's not working or when alternative approaches seem more attractive. Here's what actually happens when you implement this strategy and maintain it through the challenges. The first year feels like you're building infrastructure without seeing results. You're setting up accounts, establishing automatic transfers, and funding your tiers, but you don't feel wealthier. The second and third years bring the first real evidence that the strategy works. Your Tier 1 emergency fund is fully established, giving you genuine financial security. Your Tier 3 and Tier 4 investments are growing. You're capturing tax advantages. The velocity of your money is higher than it's ever been. By year 5, the compounding across multiple tiers starts producing noticeable results. Your investments are growing faster because they're tax optimized. Your emergency fund means you never pay credit card interest. Your strategic leverage through real estate or other investments is amplifying your returns. By year 10, the banking strategy has produced wealth that's dramatically higher than traditional approaches would have delivered. You have liquidity, growth, leverage, and tax efficiency all working together. By year 20, you've built substantial wealth, not through any single brilliant decision, but through consistently applying the same principles that banks use to build billion-dollar institutions. The banking strategy isn't a secret in the sense that it's hidden or illegal. It's a secret in the sense that banks profit more when you don't understand it. They want you to keep your money in low-interest savings accounts while they leverage it to generate high returns. They want you to borrow from them at high rates while investing conservatively. They want you to ignore tax efficiency and velocity and strategic leverage because your inefficiency is their profit. The moment you start thinking like a bank, rather than a bank customer, you flip the equation. You become the one capturing the spread, maximizing the velocity, optimizing the taxes, and using strategic leverage. The wealth you're capable of building isn't limited by your income. It's limited by how efficiently you deploy whatever income you have. The banking strategy gives you the same framework that financial institutions use to turn modest capital into substantial wealth. The system works. The question is whether you'll implement it. If this opened your eyes, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Be Invest Your Future Self will thank you.